I thought instead of giving you an overview, which is probably you can get from really the website of the Commission, which is HIVlawcommission.org, I'd try and make the link between the topics to be discussed in the next couple of days and the work of the Commission. That's criminalization and what's the Commission doing in relation to that. You'll get a lot of information on the Commission, like I said, on the website. Its real goal is to develop actionable evidence-informed, rights-based recommendations for effective AIDS responses that mitigate the impact of HIV and promote and protect the human rights of people living with and most vulnerable to HIV. I mean, this is a very dry, boring, jargon-filled statement, but I think the idea is that the Commission makes these recommendations not to lie on the shelves, but to be used by policymakers and to be used by advocates to actually see that actionable stuff happens on the ground and that reform takes place. And I could talk a lot about how things are already moving in somewhat in certain directions, but we don't have the time. Happy to take questions during breaks and stuff. So some of the objectives of the Commission were to analyze existing evidence and generate new evidence. And I'll explain to you how some of that has happened because it relates directly to this topic. Develop the recommendations, increase awareness amongst key constituencies. And so there's been a whole method by which we've tried to engage law and policymakers at national levels with and civil society, bring them together, have a conversation, increase awareness, revive some of the conversation which has kind of fallen by the wayside around a lot of issues on HIV and the law, and actually encourage a public dialogue. And I just got back, actually, interestingly enough, 2 weeks ago from a very public dialogue on HIV and the law in Belize, where the entire dialogue was broadcast on a radio channel which is listened to by everyone in the country, to the whole country. So everyone was listening in, and the government, of course, got completely stressed out, and I was harassed at immigration. But it was interesting that we just opened up the whole conversation around sexuality and morality and stuff, and it was so we're already seeing a little bit of movement. And then, like I said, engage with civil society, empower civil society to actually be able to advocate for change. The commissioners, you will get their details again on the website. These are the 4 focus areas of the Commission it must kind of look at. Laws and practices that effectively criminalize and discriminate against people. So that's very broad language, but it certainly includes criminalization of transmission and exposure, as it does criminalization of sexual orientation or sodomy, criminalization of sex work, etc. Laws and practices that mitigate or sustain violence and discrimination as lived by women, which includes gaps in the law vis-a-vis sexual assault laws, domestic violence laws, etc., and how they impact on vulnerability, and of course women who are HIV positive and how discrimination reinforces their marginalization and actually affects their health. Treatment access issues related to the law, particularly patent law, and then finally issues of law in HIV pertaining to children. That's a variety of things, including age of consent issues. The Commission began its work in June 2010. It will conclude by early next year, so we have a time frame, and all this has happened pretty rapidly, but it's happened with a lot of consultation, so I think there's a lot of mobilization around this just taking place in the last 18 months. I thought this would, I thought I should share with you this, which is most kind of topical for this meeting we're having now. What are the outputs vis-a-vis criminalization of HIV transmission exposure that will come out of this process? Well, there are 2 working papers that have been written. The working papers are going to be published, but they're presently being finalized. They'll be on the website and hopefully published in a journal of some sort. There is Matthew Wheat's paper, which is a global review of the law on criminalization of HIV exposure and transmission. And then Scott, Barris, and Matthew have written a paper on the criminalization morality, moral responsibility for sexual transmission. And then we had this whole process of regional dialogues. So we've had 7 of these across the world, where we've got civil society and government to sit across the table and have a conversation on a lot of these issues. And this process called for submissions to be made by civil society on matters that affect them. Academics, people in the field, people affected, legal aid providers, human rights activists, etc. So we received about 650 submissions across the globe, 62 of which related to criminalization of HIV transmission exposure. That's sort of the breakup of where a lot of them came from. And an analysis of submissions is underway right now, actually, which will also be published. But what I share with you right now is a very, very early stage of that analysis. We received, so out of those 62, you could see submissions discussed. The blue lines are specific laws criminalizing HIV, and then the red ones talk about the application of general criminal law to HIV. And so you get a sense of where people, activists, etc., are feeling possibly impact. And a lot of this is, of course, anecdotal. It's very much about an individual experience. It's not necessarily scientific, research, but it's about often legal aid provision in these contexts, etc. And so I thought I'd just give you a very quick overview of, well, what these submissions are telling us in three categories. Well, the first is on HIV-specific laws. And we found mostly these were from Africa and high-income countries, either in omnibus HIV legislation or in criminal codes specifically introduced on HIV. Sometimes criminalizes non-disclosure to spouses. A lot of the concerns that were expressed include issues of the fact that intent is not required in a lot of these laws, significant risk is not required, risk reduction in disclosure or consent are not considered as grounds for defense. There are disproportionate sentences, vague language, the failure of the law to account for the changing implications of an HIV diagnosis in terms of treatment, and then matched with lack of real proper legal advice to defend oneself and weak evidence accepted by the courts. So the rigor of evidence is not really a standard that the courts necessarily follow. And some of the submissions even talked about how prejudice is reflected in the judiciary itself on a lot of these issues. And impact in Africa, for instance, even though there were no prosecutions, there was a sense that the existence of these laws are known to people and could potentially deter people from testing. And there's a disproportionate impact on women, in particular, in cultural and traditional contexts. Impact on stigma. The mere presence of the law fuels HIV-related stigma within society and reflected in the court cases and court pronouncements. And there's association with police excesses, unlawful arrests, physical violence, refusal to grant lawful entitlements to HIV-positive people in prisons. Then there were some submissions related to criminalization in general criminal codes. Again, mostly in high-income countries, the application of offenses relating to transmission of infectious diseases generally. Those are the general criminal codes within which this was captured. And then there's the application of general criminal offenses like aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, etc. There's an inconsistent jurisprudence that has been generated through this, and there's certainly a skewed racial impact that was felt. And then there's the third type of law under which a lot of this gets captured, which is public health law. Few submissions. Such laws bestow white powers in the state, for example, to isolate people living with HIV regardless of conduct. And often such laws effectively criminalize because migrant workers, for instance, are forcibly tested and incarcerated and deported as a consequence of their HIV status. And finally, certainly some positive examples. There have been challenges to laws that criminalize HIV exposure and transmission through advocacy in the courts or with legislators. So we've seen that, for instance, in Europe. And then there's success because of arguments of obsolescence and unenforceability, vagueness and arbitrariness of these laws, which have convinced lawmakers to take a new position on some of the stuff, and then prosecutorial guidelines which exist in England and Wales. So that gives you an overview of how the Commission is actually going to be engaged on some of these issues.